The University of Scranton acknowledges the original inhabitants and nations of this land, the Lenape, the Munsee, the Shawnee, and the Susquehannocks. May we be ever mindful of their legacy and contributions and commit ourselves to stewarding this land with care and compassion as we navigate our communities towards faith and justice. So once again, good evening. My name is George Alicio. I am the Dean of the Weinberg Memorial Library and the Director of the Schemel Forum. And on behalf of the Friends of the Weinberg Memorial Library, the Schemel Forum, and the University of Scranton, I thank you for joining us tonight to discuss a timely and important topic. Books challenge, inspire, inform, and transform. Books possess the power to tell a story, to document knowledge, and to disseminate ideas. These things make us human, and the book, in its many forms, has been fundamental to human civilization. In the United States, we are witnessing a surge in book bans and censorship. These problems are not new. The philosophical basis of censorship can be found as far back as Plato's Republic, where Plato saw censorship as a means to ensure the collective control of the social fabric of society. If we take Plato's idea, then censorship is about the control of thought, the limiting of potential, and the directing of societal evolution. 2,000 years after Plato, John Stuart Mill, another philosopher, challenged the philosophical value of censorship when he argued that the best method for determining the best ideas was through freedom of expression and the testing of those ideas in public forums. That said, the plight of book bans and censorship that we are witnessing today does not appear as philosophically disciplined. It seems to come from a darker place. In our information age, where ideas are more accessible than ever, the act of banning and censorship has become even more significant, challenging our very perceptions of democracy, liberty, truth, and progress. To help us navigate this complex terrain, we have with us tonight a very distinguished guest. Tracie D. the former executive director of the American Library Association, has dedicated much of her life at the crossroads of democracy, equity, and free expression. Tracie's work toward bettering our democracy and our freedoms is laudable, and she has been recognized repeatedly for her contributions. To name just a few of those honors, she received the Literarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American Literary Community from the National Book Foundation in 2022. She was named one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World in 2023. And just recently, she was awarded the Freedom of Speech and Expression Medal from the Roosevelt Institute. So clearly, we have the right person here to help us navigate this complex terrain. And after we get to hear from Tracie, there'll be time for Q&A. And I know many of you know me saying this. Sorry, I can't get the word out. I know many of you know, wait for the microphone so we can have it on the recording. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Tracie D.
Hello, everybody. Hi, I cannot thank George and the library staff and faculty enough for their kind hospitality. And I love your preface to this conversation. It was really fitting. And I also cannot move forward without acknowledging the incredible Charles Kratz. Charles, raise your hand. Yes. Charles has left an amazing institution with amazing leaders, and when I received the email invitation to come to Scranton from Charles, I was working with one of my staff members, former staff members at ALA. I said, I didn't even know the date. I said, whatever Charles wants, Charles gets. And I mean that because he has such a distinguished career as a librarian. And it really is in that vein that I want to have this conversation with you, to sort of ask each of you, what do we want our legacy to be? And if we will allow censorship to represent who we are as a contemporary democracy, then I think that will signal some things about us as a collective that we may not have intended. So I really want to posit this conversation today as if I am talking to each of you, because I am. And this is a conversation that I've asked myself as a librarian and hopefully at this point a public scholar. If I am quiet, if I don't turn my attention to this issue and turn my attention to it fully, then what will my own legacy be? So book bans and censorship, and what I'm hoping will result is that this will be a call to action. Now you have an opportunity to ask questions, and that's what I'm really waiting for. So I'm going to be moving quickly because I want to see what questions are inspired, what comments you may have, and how you will talk back to this moment, because I'm definitely implicating you as an actor. So as we have heard and seen everywhere, how many of you have seen something in the news in the last month about censorship? At least one thing, raise your hand. If you see more than one thing, maybe 3 or 5 different articles, keep your hand up in the last month. If you've seen more than 5, keep your hand up. Okay, yeah. So everybody has seen the ways in which a conversation about censorship is really occupying our not only our political discourse, but also our civic and social discourse. And I choose the book, The Hill We Climb, to begin with, because how many of you remember the inaugural poem by Amanda Gorman? Yeah. And in the poem, The Hill We Climb, she's reciting this poem that she's written, the youngest inaugural poet laureate. She's reciting this poem, and we have all just collectively witnessed quite a number of things, including the murder of George Floyd, and we are also still in the midst, without a vaccine, of COVID-19, starting to crest towards perhaps about 500,000 deaths in the country, and we are unsure of what will happen next, and we are facing a moratorium, especially healthcare, about talking openly about COVID-19 and disease mitigation. So we are in the midst of a certain type of censorship. Yet the hopeful and young Amanda Gorman entreats us to understand the project of democracy as something that we must continue to build together, no matter who we are or where we come from or what our differences might be. And that is the book that was selected to be restricted in the state of Florida. This book about social repair. This book about the project of co-building and co-maintaining our democracy. The reason why I start with that is because if we aren't necessarily paying attention, if we aren't listening closely, if we aren't reading closely, then what we may begin to assume is that censorship is a type of custodial act. It is an act of protection rather than an act of control. Now, when the book was restricted, and of course, at first it was, the language was banned, and then it was walked back in the state of Florida, and even DeSantis himself began to backpedal about exactly what happened and why this particular book was banned. But I choose it because it was and is a book that there would be a legal term, no good reason to censure. So let's look at censorship's macro and micro level impacts. So we all know that book bans are at an all-time high, and we'll compare that in a bit to the McCarthy era. We know also that book bans, the majority of book bans, or 58% of book bans or censorship efforts, are lobbied at school libraries, and 48% at public libraries, and the other small percentage at independent bookstores. We are also seeing more and more efforts, especially state-sanctioned efforts, to reduce children's access or youth access to reading materials. And we know that the majority of books that are being banned today are young adult books, either memoirs or fiction or nonfiction aimed at adults, and we'll get into that. And then we also know that an increasing number of books for that age group are not only directed at LGBTQIA materials, but just at authors of color, regardless of what the subject matter is. So regardless of what the subject matter is, if the book is intended for young audiences and is written by a person of color, that we also see the book being censored, banned, or restricted. Got to use all the semantics. So let's look at the topics. Why are books being banned? So this is the most recent study that we have, and we know that the majority of books being banned, the slight majority, are written by and about LGBTQIA authors, subjects, or themes. The next large percentage is protagonists or secondary characters of color. Sexual content is vastly less if we think about that. Obviously, books that discuss race and racism that are even written by white authors. And then any themes of any type of civil rights or activism. And again, memoir. And once again, we return to books and stories about religious minorities. And we know that 3 of the most banned books in history, of course, are the Bible, the Talmud, and the Quran. So I wanted to take some of the books that are making the list, the all-time, books. What's happening here? So let's start with Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Amazing, amazing film that came out based on this book. Everybody, really got into the film. Judy Blume is having a revival at 85 years old, looking sharp, and still on the warpath against censorship. But why was this book banned? This book was banned for 2 reasons that are cited repeatedly. One is because it offers frank conversation about menstruation. And you don't raise your hands, but how many, I can just at least say one person on this stage learned about menstruation from this book. And I see some of you raising your hands. Absolutely. The other reason why this book was banned is because in the book, the protagonist, Margaret, is having these conversations with herself about her religious identity. And she is thinking about her parents' Jewish identity and her other parents' Christian identity, and really trying to weigh and wrangle with which identity she's going to choose for herself. And the fact that she doesn't come out right away and say, well, of course, Christianity, is another reason why this book is banned. Second book, Ruby Bridges Goes to School, a book about integration. On the strength of this book being about integration, this book has been banned in multiple states, despite the fact that supposedly public schools are integrated. Next book, All Boys Aren't Blue, George M. Johnson. In the book, George talks about his own experience of being repeatedly molested at the age of 10. And the book is intended for young adults who are slightly older, high school age. The book is banned for the frank conversation about sexuality and pornography. We'll talk about that. And then lastly, Toni Morrison's work of fiction, The Bluest Eye, which is a book about the unfortunate topic of incest. that happens and is a lived experience of far too many children. This book has also been challenged, banned, and restricted on the basis of pornography. So the fact that this is happening is concerning, but where this is happening is also concerning. When you look at the map of attempts to restrict access to books in 2022, you see far too many of our states now engaging in some aspect of state endorsed legislation to restrict books. So this is something now that legislators are actually passing. And also, I have a frequently targeted book for book bans here, the 1619 Project, that is banned not because it is not factual, it is a treatment or understanding of slavery in this country and its contemporary political encumbrances. And the book is banned not because it is not factual, but because it is unsettling. The 1619 Project, the book, was one of the first targets of the anti-CRT movement. And the reason why I want to dredge up critical race theory is because one of the things that we know is that there was this notion that critical race theory was what was being sort of propagated or proselytized at the K through 6 level. We don't see any evidence of that. And we also know that censorship itself capitalizes on disinformation and sensationalism, even as it engineers these faux grassroots campaigns like Moms for Liberty, which is working and operating at the grassroots level and has proselytized and persuaded people to join, especially targeting PTAs and PTOs. And as we know now, there's a playbook for how that movement has grown. But again, there are efforts lodged at the grassroots level, but not emanating from the grassroots. So I wanted to just talk about that. And we know that the CRT backlash was largely orchestrated. We're hearing more and more. Unfortunately, we are at a time where journalism has been defunded, largely critical journalism. And so we are waiting just until now, the third year of massive and mounting censorship, to see the kind of journalism that we really need to push back on it. And I want to commend the Washington Post because they are doing, I think, an extraordinary job. But they find that 83% of Americans say books should never be banned for criticizing U.S. history. 85% oppose banning them for airing ideas that people disagree with, and they themselves, who the people surveyed, and 87% oppose banning them for discussing race or depicting slavery. So then where was this coming from? If 85% of the people don't agree with censorship on the basis of talking about unsettling racialized histories, where was this effort coming from? Where is it coming from now? So I want to talk about debunking the myths that propagate book banning. I want to square that frankly and talk about that frankly. Number one of the most lobbied challenges is that a book isn't age appropriate. So I'm gonna just let you read what Kirkus reviews remind us. Again, no one is just going in and saying, I like the color blue, that book has a blue cover, let's just buy it, right? These are books that are reviewed. And of course, one of the first criteria is what is the content of the book, and is it suitable for an audience in my community, at my school, etc. Most of the books that are being challenged today, again, are young adult books that are written for young adult audiences. So we're not seeing books in which the protagonist is a 67-year-old, a man. We're seeing books where the protagonist is 13 years old or 10 years old or 16 years old, as in Laurie Halse Anderson's Speak, which has been widely banned. It is the story of a young woman who survives date rape. And that book is repeatedly banned on the grounds that it is not age appropriate, even though it is written for an audience of the same age. Another frequently lodged challenge is that the book is pornographic. And yet we know that the definition of pornography is content that is intended to sexually arouse or titillate. Books that are written about young people having sexual experiences are often illustrative, instructive of what a young person may be going through at that time or what an adult went through at that period. And so we know that when we're reading Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, that it is not meant to be pornographic at all. And in fact, if we read it against those definitions, in fact, if we read the majority, the overwhelming majority of the books that are being accused of being pornographic against the actual definition of pornography, we see that there really are no grounds for that challenge. And lastly, as we've talked about, that books are unflattering or unsettling. And as I've said, the overwhelming majority of Americans say that books should not be censored or banned on this basis. So again, who's behind the book banning? Why are the books being banned? Are people reading the books? I know, having attended more hearings than I'd like in which books are being banned, there's always that moment when the person who is, and sometimes it's just one or two people who will come to a school district and say, or to a public library forum or meeting of the board and say, we need to have these books banned. And I'm always waiting for this moment, which never fails me, hasn't failed me yet, in which someone who is challenging the book will say, well, I myself haven't read the book, but I did read this passage that was excerpted and sent to me. And on that basis, I don't think anyone should read the book. Now, let's remember what Ray Bradbury, author of Fahrenheit 451, who was one of the most frequently challenged or censored, banned authors of his time, he said that the real issue is not necessarily just the censoring of books. It is creating a climate in which people do not read. And so I want to talk about that as well. But before I go further, how's this going? It's all right? All right, good. Because I can't just be here talking. You got to be with me, And hopefully for most of you, you're seeing some things that might support arguments. And if I'm challenging others, that's great. That's great because I want both of those things to happen. So let's take it back and let's go to the 1940s to the early 1950s with Senator Joseph McCarthy. How many of you, anybody alive during the McCarthy era? Yes. Wow. So we really got to hear from you here. Yeah, no, it's important. I'm really trying to, I say I got my GED in McCarthy because I've been reading for years as much as I can, looking at testimonies. There's wonderful films that we should revisit. Hopefully you'll be able to show a few of them here that talk about, or at least are set against this era. And Senator McCarthy had, his House Committee on Un-American Activities, in which he was really looking for and trolling for what he believed to be communism. But oftentimes what he believed to be communism was really also free expression. And he challenged free expression. His first target was comic books and graphic novels because he believed that comic books and graphic novels were really set at the level of the worker to quickly digest very sophisticated information in graphic form. And so he had a whole campaign against comic books and graphic novels. I mean, he was very astute. His understanding of information theory and how information flows was very, very astute. Then he began to challenge books like Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, which was an early primer of the civil rights movement, because we know that the first civil rights efforts, the first sit-ins actually happened in libraries to desegregate libraries well before they reached lunch counters. So again, civil disobedience, along with later when the young Dr. King would begin to promote Gandhi. Before that, Thoreau's Civil Disobedience was really one of those playbooks or guidebooks for the early civil rights movement. And of course, it was caught in McCarthy's crosshairs, as was John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which elevated and talked about labor, especially extractive labor, investigated that. Howard Pyle's Robin Hood, because it castigated wealth hoarding and wealth gatekeeping. And then finally, of course, and he famously put Du Bois and Hughes on the stand because because W.B. Du Bois would hazard to suggest that there could be a talented class of Black people in this country, which and then, of course, Langston Hughes, because he had a character, Just Be Simple, serialized form in graphic novel form, in which Just Be Simple talked about what it was like to be a Black blue-collar worker in the 40s. And so these are the books that were being banned. Do you see any correlation or any similarity to books that are being banned today? Raise your hand if so. Yeah, absolutely. Labor, race. Another book that was, very much banned is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Again, because of women's agency in talking about constructing the body. Body agency, especially in women's hands, has always been considered dangerous. So I would like to say this without reading all of these things here. Censorship is not happening in a silo. When I am asked to speak about censorship, especially in Washington, it is always in connection to freedom of religion or other aspects of freedom of speech or voting rights. We are in a period now where many of our foundational constitutional rights are being challenged. The right to read, or freedom of speech and freedom of expression, is just one of those protected by the First Amendment. But in fact, censorship is happening at a time where there is a massive effort to delegitimize all of the institutions that protect certain aspects of our civil rights and our foundational rights. If you know what I'm saying there, just raise your hand. I just want you to be with me because I don't want to just be talking. Because what we could say is that if we were to go down the list of our constitutional rights, we could make tick marks in terms of what's being challenged and where it's being challenged. And so what I'm saying is that libraries, for a number of reasons, are one of those places, because we today are the main protector of especially freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the right to read. And of course, there are other spaces too. But censorship is a Trojan horse. I also wanted to make sure that you know and are looking at the fact that the legislation around censorship, especially book censorship, is being closely followed by other legislation to defund public libraries. And certainly, we've already seen that battle has been won, unfortunately, when it comes to school libraries, because there are so few school libraries today, and they tend to be in the most resource communities where they can be supplemented by parents, or where there are parents who are politically vested enough to kind of fight for libraries. But the reality is that in my lifetime as a librarian, we have seen the erosion of school libraries. And we know that school libraries are one of those supporters of educational attainment. So I just want you to remember the good old days with me. Remember when all we had to worry about was misinformation, right? Just wrong information. Those were the good old days. In librarianship, we really fought about that. Journalism was always correcting itself. Those were the good old days. Our baseline right now is disinformation, and disinformation is intentional misinformation. It is misinformation for a purpose. We also have information poverty, where we have whole communities that don't have access to information. We'll talk about that in a minute. We also have information disparity, where this group here has access to timely information, factual information, but you don't. And maybe people don't care. And then we have information redlining, which I've spent a lot of my career writing about. Information redlining is where your information disparity is for gain. We're keeping all of the information over here. We're investing in all of the information infrastructure over here, and you all don't get it because you live in a certain community or because you represent a certain type of threat. And then there is information exclusion. There is information. We're not going to tell you about it, though. You're not going to have access to it. And then finally, there is information withdrawal, which is what censorship is. And it is considered the most egregious form of an information ill, in which there was information, but we remove it. And sometimes we pretend it didn't even exist. And we're not only seeing that happen on bookshelves, but we're seeing that happening digitally as well, at the level of digital catalogs, where traces of titles or even whole subject matters are disappearing from online catalogs. I talked about redlining, but I definitely want to make sure that I call it out a little bit more here, because sometimes we can unwillingly engage in it. We can unwillingly propagate a certain information sort of access style in which some folks just never get the same information as people who are wealthier or people who look different or people who live over here. And it's really important for me to just mention that. And we can talk more about it if you have questions. But what I have tried to add to contemporary librarianship is my own definition of information redlining, which is the systematic denial of equitable access to information, information services, and information retrieval methods. Because this has actually made censorship something that is building and growing and waxing. There is a whole connection between censorship and socio-political disenfranchisement. As we've heard from Platonic days, Socratic days, censorship is not new. We see censorship whenever there is a desire to control what happens to the state, access to the state, or to control who is considered to be a legitimate citizen or someone who can question the state. We also see censorship happen as a first step towards any kind of totalitarianism or authoritarianism. So whenever we see censorship, state-sanctioned censorship, we should always be concerned. And we see censorship happen even when there is a performance around equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And so what I will say is that intellectual freedom and equity, diversity, inclusion have to be mutually reinforcing principles. So where you see one uplifted in the absence of the other, then that tells us that we should question both. So I want Travis to raise his hand because it's probably awkward, but there's Travis Prince, the artist who made this incredible and arresting portrait here. And I want to give Kim the credit for talking to me about his work, and I was so intrigued. The reason why I wanted to share this is because I think what Travis does here with this particular portrait and in all of the others that I've seen and the titles that are associated with them is to talk about something that I don't think we talk about enough. And it's really one of the things that I hope to focus on over the next year as I work towards a book lift study in looking at the connection between compulsory illiteracy and censorship. There has been in this country and others efforts to keep people from reading. And let me just say this, censorship is built on the foundations of people either not having access to information, not being able to read it, or feeling like access to information is somehow problematic. Those are the foundations of censorship. So I'm just sharing here just some of the Black Code laws that existed from 1740 until even after emancipation, because we know that 1865 wasn't the magic bullet in ending enslavement. But where you see some of these laws, you also see prohibitions against Black people learning to read, and even white people teaching Black people to read. They were some of the most egregious punishments. I'm talking about the gouging out of eyes, the cutting off of fingers, and for both Blacks and whites, Blacks caught reading or knowing how to read, and whites who instructed them. We're talking about both corporal punishment, which I've just described, but also jail time and fine and paying of fines. So there's something about the nature of information that anytime there is a system built on control or extraction where access to information is very dangerous. So what I am saying here is that in the midst of unprecedented censorship that is at a pitch and a level that we've never seen before in this country, we need a reading revolution. So I don't want to depress anyone any further. I don't know how you're doing. I don't know how you're holding up, but I don't want to depress you any further. But I definitely want you to leave here with good, solid information. And as I've said, the other thing that is aiding and abetting the rise of censorship is that we just aren't reading. We aren't reading in the way that we have. Here's a research from Pew that lets us know who hasn't read a book in the past 12 months. And we see that it is raised, we see that it is gendered, and we see that it has some geographic application, especially in terms of people who live in the suburbs or in rural communities, income, obviously age. And so what I'm saying here is that censorship is really being aided and abetted by the number of people who can't read, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the number of people who don't read. So let's talk about the number of people who can't read. What we know is about 43 million adults in the US can't read above a fifth grade level. We have normalized that. Those statistics have been mounting. In fact, the American project of building public libraries was built to counter this by people like Carnegie and Kellogg and Rosenwald. Building public libraries was like the old Starbucks, right? Or now the new, the Whole Foods. When you saw a Starbucks or a Whole Foods coming at one point, you knew, okay, this community, something's about to happen here. Well, that's what people felt about public libraries. People were rallying to get public libraries built in their communities, even at a time where adult literacy wasn't even normalized. We're talking about periods where 2 out of 5 adults couldn't read, or certainly in almost all communities, 1 out of 5. Well, guess what? We have returned to those numbers. I was just looking at information around Scranton and adult literacy here, and knowing that you are wrangling with that issue as well in the city. 61% of low-income families have no children's books in their homes. Literacy is a multi-generational issue. Children whose parents have low literacy levels have a 72% chance of being at the lowest reading level. Adults with low literacy skills are left out of all critical communication chains. Ripe for censorship, isn't it? Ripe for reliance on information that is not factual, ripe for reliance on disinformation, ripe for reliance of a return to oral information, or in a time where we are really reliant on social media, where most people, their news comes from social media, and what we know is that what people are attracted to social media are the reels in which people are talking. It means then that people are less likely to actually build their point of view on evidence-informed information, right? On information that's built on evidence. And we know this. The Skills Coalition, the Center for Skills Coalition, had a study that I thought was really interesting, the new landscape of digital literacy, because now we're predicated on not just reading, but also on digital skills. And we also have a large number of people who are not online. And we have a lot of workers who are clinging to jobs that require the lowest level of sometimes reading and digital literacy skills, and sometimes, subjecting to themselves to extractive labor because they don't feel that they have the educational tools, or even training access, to move up, to move into jobs that are going to require more sophisticated skills. And again, we have to remember that there is a large number of people who are not online at all. They're not using the internet at all, and we know that the internet is the basis of now access to public health, access to education, and also access to economic mobility or to employment. We can't afford to miss the connections between low literacy, censorship, and over incarceration. We know that jails or prisons are sort of the ground zero for censorship. They are spaces in which we have normalized little to no access to information. And there are so many things that tell us, so many areas of research that remind us that the low literacy to prison pipeline is alive and well. And here are just some. U.S. prisons ban a staggering number of books and campaigns. I'm really concerned about incarceration because I've never been a librarian without having a family member who has been incarcerated, and I've had the personal experience of sending books meant to support your education or to help you think about what's going to happen if you get out of prison or when you get out of prison, because 95% of people will return to their communities, only to have those books sent back, right? Again and again and again. And we also know that there is a connection, famously so, between jails and the number of prisons and jails that we have, and also people who don't read well. And finally, one thing I want to just, it always breaks my heart to talk about this, but 85% of all juveniles who have some kind of juvenile court or carceral involvement are functionally low literate. So these are people who have been given up on in schools, and many of them will spend the better part of their adulthood incarcerated. Finally, and I'm bringing it home so we can have our conversation, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the quality of reading. And we talked about this a little bit. I had lunch today with some of the faculty and staff at the library. And one thing that I'm really concerned about is what we consider reading, we're not really doing. And I have to challenge myself because I read a lot. I consume a lot of information. And sometimes, and I read a lot online because a lot of the journals and articles that I want to read are online. I rarely am reading like in a tactile fashion with, of course I read the newspaper, but I'm always on the go. So I'm reading always like on this or my laptop. And I have to challenge myself self about reading because what we do now, how many of you read what you say you consume most of your news online? Raise your hand. Oh, it's okay. Most people do today. It's all right. But one thing we have to warn ourselves about is what Marianne Wolf calls skim reading. The fact that we are just reading just enough to kind of get the gist, but not to read for true comprehension, right? Because in reading, we have these three acts, right? It's enough to access information, but we should also interpret it and be able to apply it. And in a lot of cases, we aren't doing that. So when we don't read or can't read, we are more susceptible to disinformation and less likely to care about or notice information withdrawal or censorship. And what many are positing, I showed you what Pew is saying about people who don't read at all after they graduate high school or college. We also have people like me who think I'm reading because I'm reading quickly and I'm skimming, but I'm really not reading really and comprehending what the information is saying. So I am less likely to go back to be able to say when I do that, now, is this true? That seems odd. So I just want us to think about that because that's another challenge. When I was at the American Library Association, one thing that we did was to create the first national campaign to counter censorship, and to say that American librarianship has to be built. Continue to be built on the foundation of intellectual freedom. And we didn't do that just, that's what I think, or that's what we thought as a collective. Those are our roots, because the group that countered Mark McCarthy was the American Library Association. The American Library Association held a forum in 1951 in New York where McCarthy was reigning supreme and putting these authors on the stand. And from that forum and the one that would follow in 1953, we have the Reader's Bill of Rights, and we have the notion of intellectual freedom and the right to read without someone being able to come in and say, oh, I have this person's name, I know they use this library, can you tell me everything that they've read in the last year, right? And so I'm not saying that the American Library Association killed McCarthy, but he did die in 1954. And the thing that I want to say there is that we have to ask ourselves, why did he reign supreme, banning and burning 30,000 books for almost 10 years? It wasn't because people weren't concerned. It wasn't because back then the majority of Americans believed in censorship. It's because nobody wanted to be the one to stand up. Everybody else thought that somebody else would handle it. And as we know, what began to happen afterwards is that we really saw the country move into a kind of a dark age, right? Where some of the notions, even around things like integration and desegregation, there are horrible and ugly pictures of us as Americans pushing back against the ideals that we have fought for. So I want to just say this, don't believe the hype. Censorship is not a deeply partisan issue. It will last only as long as we permit it. There's so much evidence and so many polls that remind us that people of all political parties and all sectors of the United States understand that the right to read is a constitutional right. So what I want to end with here is this. Before I left the American Library Association, I received 2 letters. One from a young man online, Travion, and he said he identified himself as an 11th grader from the South. And he talked about the fact that books were being banned in his community, and he really wanted to go to college. And he and some of his friends were worried about where they were going to be able to get these books from, because they knew that many of the books that were being banned were also books that corresponded with questions on the SAT. And he didn't want to be somehow less qualified to answer than his counterparts. And so he asked about that because he didn't think that they would have enough money to buy all of those books. And he also shared that there weren't really bookstores in his community either. The second is from a young woman named Sadie. And Sadie's 13 years old. And she goes to school in a suburb of Illinois. And what she wanted to know is, Miss Hall, how long will this last, this censorship? I like to read about other people. When I read about people that I don't know, it helps me to understand them better. How long will censorship last? Is there anything that I can do? And then she asked, what are you doing? Thank you very much. So I think Kim has the microphone for a couple of questions.
Let me preface my question by saying I think I'm playing the devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Until the end of your talk, where you talked about learning how to read deeply, it seemed as though one of the causes of censorship initiatives is the existence of misinformation or disinformation. And therefore, weirdly enough, censorship is taking place because there's too much information out there, and a lot of it is wrong and it's bad. But there's too much out there, and people are unqualified or unable to make a distinction between good information and bad information. So I think there's a problem with too much information and a lack of the intellectual tools to evaluate it. So I was glad to see that you had moved into that question of, well, okay, let's not just skim, but let's read deeply. But I think that's where the emphasis has to be, because with the digital age, we're not short of information. We have, in some ways, too much of it, but we have to evaluate it. If you want to comment on that, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, there's a lot of evidence that, obviously, people will talk about information gluts, but I think, the tension is that there's a disagreement between what information is good information and what information is bad information, right? Because we are in an era where if it is politically motivated, stories can be twisted and turned. We're seeing that, everywhere. But I do think that, that's for me why I've come to the point, at least at this point in my evolution in dealing with this issue, that we really need a reading revolution. We need to focus on reading and closer reading. And we also have a responsibility of making sophisticated information more accessible, because sometimes the really sophisticated and factual information is written on a ninth or often a 12th grade level or beyond. So it renders it inaccessible to most people. And we also have to grapple with the fact that we are more closely connected as a group than we might think, because the people who are able to get into this room, to know about this, to feel comfortable in coming, tend to be more closely connected than the people who aren't, right? And so I think we also have to think about the fact that we are living in both information disparity, a time of information disparity, and also where our sort of socioeconomic and educational attainment is creating these sort of like pods of community, as opposed to like the collective Scranton.
Can you talk about the relationship between censorship and social media, Twitter, which is now called X, for example? And my other question has to do with the recent statements and protests by students regarding Hamas and Israel.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that in terms of what your subject matter is?
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously, you think about a platform like Twitter, in which notions of speech and censorship, often too were like connected with like conservative voices, as well. We know that there's like a lot of evidence that says that, oftentimes in certain types of discursive communities, like a university, like conservative speech is, usually sort of frowned upon. And so you have these platforms more and more, that are created to allow certain types of free speech to sort of reign supreme. But then you also see algorithmically where some of those platforms also then go the other way, in which they're kind of looking for censoring and then clamping down on speech that would counter or correct the kind of speech that they're allowing. And so I think that we haven't figured that out. Social media is just another one of those places that I think it is a legitimate space, for sure. So we can't think about social media as, some as different. It is, a legitimate discursive space, but, that's where we are wrangling. And I think we're wrangling also because of AI, and I'm not talking about AI in terms of people acting like what's new with, that AI is new. We've been living with AI for like, more than 15 years, in which if I am a part of certain types of groups online or I interact with, I like or repost certain types of stories, those are the stories that I'm more likely to see. So I think the other thing in terms of censorship is that there's a lot of algorithmic censorship that's also happening in social media, in which there's more and more curation so that I'm more likely to see the things that I want to see and less likely to see the things that might challenge me, educate me, or that I might interact in other ways. I think when we think about what's happening, especially, in campus speech around Gaza. And I was just on Saturday, I was just in conversation with Tom Ginsberg, who runs the Institute for Free Expression at the University of Chicago. And we were talking about academic speech. And I was saying how I'm so pleased to see sorry, because of the antecedent, like what caused it or what catalyzed it, but I'm happy to see more and more universities take responsibility for speech in a way of allowing speech to sort of be dialectic, allowing speech to be both ways. And I think that this is a conversation that campuses, are dealing with certain, there's a lot of like sort of soft censorship or shadow censorship, that we see as well, certainly with students who might object to a certain syllabus or say, I'm not going to read this, or, I'm not going to be here for the class if it deals with these particular things. So I think that it's important that we wrestle with the issue of censorship and also with selective information at the level of the university. And we're doing that right now. I also think that we have to think about when does a university get a chance to say or have the right to say what speech should look like on the campus? I think that universities have to approach that very delicately because the university can usurp then the right for individuals to speak on campus as well. So I think it is a big question, and we'll see what continues to happen. But in information theory, what we know, to your point about the proliferation of information, what we know about information is that information wants to be free. Right, information wants to escape any type of container and and find an audience. And so I think that that's what's happening on college campuses, and I think that's why we're going to continue to need to read very carefully and to have fact checking happening in information systems as well. Yes, she's coming right now. So thank you.
So in fighting against censorship, you suggested that it's important to encourage reading, that that's a priority. Mm-hmm. So what kind of policies or movements could be put in place or are being put in place to encourage reading that you speak about?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a couple, I think there's some good legislation out there. So one, of course, is the student right to read that was passed, students' right to read that was passed not so long ago, that really tried to push against the elimination of school libraries and reading resources, and saying basically that all students have the right to read and to libraries and to well-staffed libraries. I think that's good legislation because it connects reading with student performance and student outcomes. The second that I've seen that I really think is great was introduced not too long ago by Emmanuel Cleaver, which is basically the Prison Libraries Act, which seeks to counter the fact that over the last several decades, I should say, is that when there was more of an emphasis on thwarting recidivism or staving off recidivism, people returning to prison over and over again, you had more investment in libraries and in literacy programs and in educational training programs, GED, adult basic education for people who were in prison, especially because there's this idea that the overwhelming majority are going to return to their communities, and they should return to those communities more skilled than they were when they left, so that there's less chance that they will return to prison. But now that we see sort of like the profit motivation sort of shifting in prisons. Even though a real minority of prisons are private prisons, we see the influence of how people think about prisons and prison budgets shifting a lot. And so we've seen really the deterioration of library services and any kind of learning services. So like you have a state like Illinois where, the budget for all of the prisons in the state of Illinois have been reduced to $750. No librarians, and maybe 47 books that were okay to read. And so with the Prison Libraries Act, it would, if it's passed, if it's ratified, it will, just as a start, provide grants up to 60 million, a total of $60 million to prisons to restore library and literacy programs. So I think that that's evidence of good legislation. And then we also see on state levels, like whether it's in Illinois or New Jersey, and I think coming up in Maryland, we're starting to see governors in particular push back against state sanctioned censorship by saying that they are putting a ban on book banning, period. So we're starting to see people fight back. But I do think that the movement won't be a movement unless it becomes a movement led by the people. And I think we need people like in this room to be able to talk to, your legislators and say, we don't want that here, and that book banning hurts everyone. Tomorrow I'll be talking to the University of Public Health down at to the School of Public Health at the University of Pennsylvania, because there's definitely a correlation between censorship and health outcomes. So I think that we also need some legislation around healthcare access too. Yeah, maybe we can take one or two. This is good. I'm having a good time. I just want to make sure we're okay with time. Okay, great. Yes.
I just want to have maybe something clarified. And it's more speech than books, but the concept that all speech would be equal. And we know that all ideas aren't necessarily equal. Some of them are repugnant, some of them are immoral, some of them are unethical. And particularly we're seeing that on college campuses now, where certain things are happening that, under the guise of free speech, are pushing ideas that are harmful. Now, the traditional answer is, well, you have speech that rebuts that, but still, there seems to be, where does the term responsibility or accountability come in to your ideas?
Yeah, well, all the time, right? So I'm talking about responsible. I'm talking about information that is quality information, right? I think all the time. I think when I definitely agree that not all information is equal, nor are all ideas. And I also think that there's speech that, has a different purpose. Some is meant to inform, even if it unsettles, but is meant to inform because it's letting us know that this is something that has happened, or this is a lived experience, not conjecture, or this is a fictional account of something that has happened. I do think, we also see, just like we see anywhere, is it okay for, me to just start shouting fire, fire, just for the heck of it? No, that is not protected speech. So I think that, to your point, we have to sort of understand what protected speech is. And we also have to make sure that if it is information that is just meant in some cases to cause a certain type of division, has no real educational intent, edification, illumination, all of those reasons why information is so valued, then we have to be able to have a space where that can be called out. And oftentimes, it should be the community into which that speech is being delivered that should call it out. Yeah, definitely. But I do agree. And I also think that we equate speech. We equate speech and call it all apples and oranges when it really is apples and oranges. And I try to think about that a lot. But I'm glad you said that, because right now that also takes a certain type of bravery. Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm an education major and I'm a history
Yes.
education major, so I want to be a high school history teacher. So we've talked a lot about book banning, both from an educational perspective and a historical perspective. How would you recommend to an educator to ensure that your classroom is a space where you can present these ideas and present these books while also providing resources and ensuring that unsettling content isn't too unsettling for kids that are, 13, 14 through 18 years old? How do you balance providing unrestricted access with also ensuring, mental well-being?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great question. I think a lot of times you have to let the book itself be your cue, right? So the usually the book will it if the author is revisiting a period when they were 10 years old and you're reading it and you're like, yeah, these are the kinds of things that happen to 10-year-olds old. Obviously you want to make sure that you prepare your young people. I mean, nobody should ever sort of feel forced, in any kind of way. But I also think that in libraries, what we do is that we tend to have some type of description of a book, especially online in a catalog, so that people have an understanding of the summary of the book and the context, right? And that way you can make an informed decision about whether or not you want to read it, or if I'm a parent, if this is appropriate for my child. And I think we have to do that as well, because you assume local parenti, obviously, as a teacher. So I think that's important too. The other thing too is to contextualize, right? So that I remember reading Anne Frank. I remember reading a lot of books that really helped me to understand, especially history and all of that. And I read them at the age and, so I was like 12 reading The Diary of Anne Frank. And I remember being like, wow. But our teacher also had prepared us, had given us a context about, World War II and all of that, told us a lot more about, what was happening with Nazism and all of those other types of things, so that I was prepared. And I think that's important. You have that responsibility, certainly. Yes. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.